Hello everyone, Mr. Mumma here, welcoming you back to U.S. History. And today we're going to be talking about Reconstruction, which will bring our semester to a close. Reconstruction is usually the last thing they talk about in U.S. History 1 and the first thing they talk about in U.S. History 2. So there'll be some overlap next semester. We're going to talk about these things some a little bit then. Before I get into this, I'd also like to point out something on the technical side. I tried to put this video up last night. Video didn't work, and I had to scrap it. I just spent, as I'm filming this, I just spent 38 minutes recording another video, and having spent 38 minutes recording it, I played it back, and I saw that, to my very sad surprise, that I had turned off the microphone when I went to adjust the volume. Their keys are right next to each other on my computer. So I recorded a 38-minute video with no sound. So this is attempt number 3 to film this video. It has been very challenging on my part. So if I sound like I'm going through it in a hurry, I apologize, but understand that this is the culmination of about 2 hours basically of talking about this same thing. Not that it's not interesting and I could talk about it for a long time, but sitting in front of a camera like this over and over again, now I know how Brad Pitt feels. But anyway. So, Reconstruction, diving right in. When last we left, the Civil War was over, Robert E. Lee was surrendering, and Abraham Lincoln was sadly getting assassinated. John Wilkes Booth walked into the theater where he was well known, being a nationally famous actor, goes to the presidential booth, shoots Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head. Abraham Lincoln's death changes the political situation profoundly. All over the place, it's grim. The South has been economically, politically, militarily, demographically annihilated. 1 out of every 3 young white men in the South is a casualty of war. For all those dead people, every dead young man is a young woman who's not going to get married. It's a kid who's not going to be born. It's taxes that aren't going to get paid. It's a field that's not going to get plowed. It's an invention that's not going to get invented. It really represents a massive demographic disaster. And in the North, where the war did not have a great, economic effect, just in terms of the North wasn't devastated the way the South was, there are still those massive demographic losses. The question before the assassination of Lincoln, the one that Lincoln basically spent the last year of his, last few months of his administration deciding, was what am I going to do about the South now that the war is over? Lincoln's idea. Remember, we talked about his theory of secession. Lincoln didn't believe it was possible for a state to secede, to leave the Union. Since it's impossible for a state to legally leave the Union, the South, the southern states, never actually left. And since they didn't actually leave, there's no need to bring them back in because they've been there the whole time, according to his legal theory. So what Lincoln proposes is something that becomes known as the 10% plan, or Lincoln's plan. And the 10%, Lincoln's Reconstruction 10% plan. And what this means is 10% of the white male population of the South pledges loyalty to the Union, to the federal government, and the state can resume normal operations. This is what's been going on up to the assassination of Lincoln. Now, Lincoln gets assassinated, things change. Things go from a mood of cautious optimism in the North to absolute horror. Lincoln, alive, had been a very controversial figure, and during the Civil War, he had done very controversial things. One thing Lincoln does, he spends habeas corpus. He takes away people's constitutional freedoms, shuts down newspapers who are critical of him. Anything he feels impedes the war. So there's that aspect of his presidency. Even in the North, there are a lot of people who consider him a tyrant, really. And after his death, though, there's this apotheosis. There's this process by which Lincoln leaves the world of men and becomes this figure of American mythology. Looking back on him now, you think of him as this universally beloved, benign figure. But of course, that's the process of mythologizing that happens after you die. It happens to Kennedy. People are assassinated, cut down the prime of their life. There's this tendency to think that they were always loved and always popular, even when that was not the case. But Lincoln, say what you will about him, was magnanimous in victory. Lincoln did not intend to punish the South and had a lot of political opposition from people who did. Now that Lincoln's dead, those people come to the fore, riding a public wave of anger, and are determined now to carry out what they think Lincoln should have done at the beginning. Now, when Lincoln dies, he's got his vice president, and the vice president steps in to succeed Lincoln. Problem is, this guy is Andrew Johnson, and this guy is no Lincoln. Unlike Lincoln, who really just came from nowhere and rose to the top, Andrew Johnson came from nowhere and kind of rose to, level above the bottom. He was a Tennessee politician. I don't want to say like he was a guy who was a failure in life. He had political success. Lincoln didn't pick him, though, because of his great political talents. Lincoln picked him because he needed a Democrat on his ticket to kind of unify political support in the North. Johnson was one of the few Democrats who would actually share a stage with Lincoln and support him. So Abraham Lincoln takes Johnson into his administration, never figuring, of course, that he's going to get assassinated. This guy's going to actually take power. Johnson had a drinking problem, all kinds of stuff. But that's what happened. Lincoln's assassinated. Johnson comes in, takes over. And now Johnson's stepping into some situation he really can't handle. It's not all Johnson's fault. One thing that Johnson doesn't have going for him is that he doesn't have any political capital. In other words, nobody owes him any favors. When you're in politics and you want to get something done, you have to promise to do something else for some other person. And you form this web of obligations and commitments and things like that that allow you to get things done. It's just sort of the currency of politics. It sounds kind of cynical to say it as if that's just, that's the way things are, but it really is how the way things are. It's why how things get done in a constitutional republic. Johnson, nobody owes him anything. And in a country dominated now by the Republican Party, a Democrat politician who just accidentally ended up in power, it doesn't really have anything he can do for anybody, and so nobody really cares much about him. And like I said, now there's this mood of anger. The Southern population are identified with, some political leadership at least, are identified with the Democrat Party. Johnson's a Democrat, so he's got that strike against him. And just all kinds of reasons why Johnson's presidency just really fails. Now, in the South, as a result of Abraham Lincoln's 10% plan, things have gotten sort of back to normal. Slavery's gone, thanks to the 13th Amendment we're going to talk about here in a minute. And so agriculture has changed in how it's organized. Where you once had plantation agriculture, slavery, now a new system comes to the fore called sharecropping. Sharecropping is this kind of medieval agricultural system where you have plantation owner owns all this land still. People come on his land and farm, and in exchange for farmland, they have to give him a percentage of whatever they grow, like a third of their crop or whatever. And it just really shows how primitive the economy has gotten at this point, that's a viable economic institution. However not efficient it is, however unviable of an economic institution that it is, it's still the only thing keeping the Southern economy going. And Southern landowners are very keen to maintain a labor supply. They've already lost a third of white men in the South. And now that the Union armies come through and freed all their slaves, a lot of the slaves are looking around saying, well, there's obviously no economic opportunities around here for us, so why don't we leave and go north? Or at least leave this region of the South and go to this other region where things are working a little better. To prevent this, movement of basically movement of labor supply around, politicians in the South pass a series of laws that collectively become known as black codes. The idea behind a black code is that it restricts the movement and labor of the newly freed slaves. Every black man in the South, every black person in the South has to carry around basically a certification that he's employed by someone. If he doesn't, he's arrested for vagrancy. There's just all kinds of restrictions on how a newly freed slave can move around and do things. A lot of politicians in the North look at this, look at the sharecropping system that comes in, looks at these black codes, looks at the fact that a lot of people who are in power in the South are the same people who were in power before the Civil War. And they say, what was the point of this war? We fought this war and to get rid of slavery and all that, and it's just there again and under another name. There's still the racial oppression. There's still all this other stuff. We need to change the South. We have this unique opportunity to eradicate this system from the South, to change their culture, to make it better. And at the forefront of this are the radical Republicans. The radical Republicans are a faction within the Republican Party. They are animated by two impulses. One, a broader commitment to racial equality than you're going to see anywhere else. And two, a desire to punish the South and to change the South into something they see as better. Among the radical Republicans, you have people like Thaddeus Stevens. You have people like Charles Sumner. Last time we encountered him, he was getting beaten by Preston Brooks over the head with a cane. He's back, and getting beaten by a cane by a Southern politician did not decrease his hatred of the South one bit, as you can well imagine. Well, the radical Republicans craft a series of bills, this idea of congressional reconstruction or radical reconstruction, where they say that 10% plan of Lincoln, that's way too nice. We haven't changed these people at all. And radical reconstruction, they passed the Reconstruction Acts. Radical reconstruction is all about punishing the South. We're going to divide up the South into 5 military districts, place each district under the command of a general. Former Confederates, anybody who served in any kind of important capacity in the Confederate Army or Confederate government, is banned from holding office or even voting. Newly freed slaves are going to be empowered. They're going to be treated with full legal equality. They're going to be taught how to exercise their rights as citizens. To that end, the Congress creates the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a government agency / volunteer agency designed to basically educate newly freed slaves, both just regular education on how to read, and educate them about their legal rights and their responsibilities now as citizens. And they are citizens because now you're starting to see the 3 big Reconstruction amendments. Even before the Reconstruction Acts, you have 13th and 14th Amendments. 13th Amendment is the amendment that gets rid of slavery. Lincoln always believed he would need some kind of constitutional amendment in order to get rid of slavery, and this now comes in. Once the southern states leave the normal political process stop happening in the North, you can pass these things. And so the 13th Amendment passes, slavery is now abolished. 14th Amendment is the big one. Obviously, slavery isn't a contemporary issue, but 14th Amendment pops up all the time. 14th Amendment is the Civil Rights Amendment. It basically says that every citizen of the United States, everyone born in the United States is a citizen, and every citizen of the United States is entitled to equal rights as a constitutional matter. Which basically means that anytime someone's civil rights are violated, the federal government then has the justification to intervene. In some ways, this is an end run around the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is, the Bill of Rights, is the most states' rights-friendly amendment. It says basically all powers not given to the Congress, federal government, are reserved for the states and the people. So if you're a Southern politician, you can say, well, we can make our black codes if we want. Congress, that's not something federal Congress can do or interfere with. That's a state matter because everything else is reserved to the state, so we can do what we want. 14th Amendment allows you to go around that, to say, yeah, you can do whatever you want, but if you do something that violates people's civil rights, then the federal government can intervene. And it still has that function today. Then you have, we talked about Reconstruction Acts. Reconstruction Acts come into being. Belt again. All right. Reconstruction Acts come into being and in 1867 and 1868, and like I said, the South's divided up. In the wake of the Reconstruction Act, you get the third of these Reconstruction era amendments, the 15th. If you think of 13th, slavery, 14th, civil rights, 15th is voting. The 15th Amendment says a person's right to vote cannot be taken away on the basis of race. The wording here is a little tricky, and you have to understand something about voting rights. You don't have a legal constitutional right to vote in and of itself. Every state sets its own rules about who can vote and who can't. All the 15th Amendment does is it says that you cannot take away someone's right to vote for this specific reason. If you wanted to say, if you're over 6 feet tall, you can't vote under our current Constitution, you could do that. I don't think anybody would, but theoretically it's possible. The 15th Amendment just says you cannot take away someone's right to vote for this specific reason. Later on, when you see women's suffrage, women's right to vote, the women's right, your right to vote cannot be taken on the basis of sex. Those are still the only two things they cannot forbid you from voting for. any other reason, it's fine. And in fact, people lose their right to vote all the time, most commonly for committing felonies or something like that. Every state has different rules. So those are the three big Reconstruction amendments, and please keep them in mind. Now, into this situation where the South is now dominated by essentially military dictatorship, you see these sort of hate figures emerge. One of whom is the carpetbagger, the other is the scalawag. There's a hate figure in sort of the Southern imagination. A carpetbagger is stereotypically a northern opportunist businessman who comes south in such a hurry that he puts all his stuff in this cheap bag made out of carpet with the idea of moving in and just taking advantage of the dire economic situation. You show up on somebody's plantation, Sherman's come through, burned everything up, still all this farmland, but it's pretty much useless, and here comes the carpetbagger with this low bid for all your land because you're desperate to sell. Another problem with the carpetbaggers in the Southern imagination, Southern mind, is that as a result of former Confederates being excluded from power, as a result of the empowerment of these newly freed slaves with voting rights, in many areas, even if you have a white majority, there are more blacks able to vote than whites. As such, you will actually have people coming to power who, a few years earlier, were actually just slaves, people who are illiterate, and some of these people come to power with actual goals of doing good, and some come to power because they're sort of the front men for very unscrupulous business interests, some local and some represented by these carpetbaggers. Now, this is a controversial subject if you're interested in Reconstruction as a whole. The most prominent American historian of Reconstruction is a guy named Eric Foner, and you can read his various books on Reconstruction to get his take on this. And of course, one side or the other, these newly freed slave politicians were just the tools of these evil white businessmen from the North, or these were people who were genuinely trying to make things better, were exploited or weren't exploited. Even that part's a myth. So you'll hear all different kinds of views of how that worked, just making that clear. Well, at any rate, that's the perception among the white population, that you have these carpetbaggers coming in, manipulating these newly freed slaves into voting for their candidates or voting for newly freed slaves themselves in order to exploit the South, in order to hand out government contracts to people and rip off the taxpayers and all that. Alongside the carpetbagger, you have another hate figure, a guy known as the scalawag. And the scalawag is a collaborator. He is someone who's from the South who has sort of switched sides and is now a supporter of the Reconstruction government and its goals. Perhaps even more hated than the carpetbagger. And in this sort of stereotype, he has similar goals in mind. He's trying to rip off the government and sort of get ahead on the backs of his fellow Southerners. How true are these stereotypes? Again, it depends kind of who you ask. Carpetbagger, on the one hand, he's an exploiter who comes down with his money to take advantage of poverty. Another way of looking at that is he's bringing in needed capital. Somebody's got to pay for all this stuff to get rebuilt. Somebody's got to be bringing new money into the system, and that's the carpetbagger. Scalawag, on the one hand, he's this opportunist, turncoat, traitor, quisling, works with the evil occupier. On the other hand, he's someone who's a reconciler. He's someone who says, listen, we shouldn't fight anymore. Let's come back together. Let's work with the system as it exists, try to make things better. So you have two sides of looking at these things. And perhaps both are true at the same time. Well, the situation being what it is, with the Union Army in the minds of many white Southerners, they are under foreign occupation. They still see themselves as a separate country, which has been conquered by another country and is being misruled by them tyrannically. One way to look at the Civil War is as an imperialist occupation, where a group of people decide they want to be their own country, and another mother country says, no, you can't, comes in, occupies with an army, and shuts that down. Sort of a suppression of a colonial uprising. America's first entry into imperialism. One way you would see that, Southern historians might see it that way. But at any rate, this feeling of being oppressed, to right or wrong, to the degree it's true or not, certainly exists in the public mind, the white mind of the public in the South. And you start to see in this context vigilante groups pop up, groups who are opposed to the Union occupation of the South, to the enfranchisement of newly freed slaves, racial equality, all that stuff. Some of these groups are just advocacy groups. Some of these groups are basically terrorist groups. You get the Knights of the White Camellia, Red Shirts, all these other people. But most prominently and famously, the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan is America's oldest existing domestic terrorist organization. It's responsible for every kind of crime from insults all the way down to the most vicious kinds of murders, bombings, arson, beatings, all kinds of stuff. And it's still around today, although its influence and presence is very, very, very exaggerated. The Klan, there are maybe 3,000 people in the Klan now, in various clans. There's even one Klan. There's all these different groups claiming to be clans, and probably 2,000 of that 3,000 are FBI informants or FBI agents trying to infiltrate and make a name for themselves. That's not to say that there aren't racist terrorist groups out there. It's just the Klan has had its, I don't want to say better days, but the Klan is no longer what it was, which I guess you can be thankful for. The Klan starts in Pulaski, Tennessee. There's a lot of controversy about who actually founds it. The name Nathan Bedford Forrest, he was a Confederate general, gets attached to it. Nathan Bedford Forrest always denied being the founder of the Klan or even being a member, but his name is attached to it. But whatever the case, the Klan starts in Pulaski, Tennessee. It starts as kind of this fraternal society. One thing you see in the late 1800s is this movement. Men join these fraternal societies. You got the older ones like the Masons. You got the Elks Lodge and Moose and Orioles and Odd Fellows. There's all these different groups, and they have meetings and smoke cigars and hang out and maybe wear some funny outfits and do some stuff. It's kind of how the Klan starts. The robes they wear, the crazy titles they have, Grand Dragon, Exalted Cyclops, the big hoods are reminiscent of these medieval penitent groups. The name Ku Klux Klan is from the Greek kuklos, which means circle, clan, referencing the Scots-Irish origins of many of its members, Scottish clan, that kind of thing. So it starts off as kind of just fun, kind of a joke. And then they start to realize the influence they have. They start to realize the power of those masks. Masks and laws don't go together very well. A mask renders you invisible. Not like, you can't see the guy, but it renders your presence invisible. It's sort of like the Plato's Ring of Gyges. Gyges was this guy, he gets a hold of a ring and makes him invisible, and obviously Lord of the Rings, J.R. Tolkien read that. But the ring makes you invisible, and for Plato, this was a way of indicating someone's degeneracy. The ring allows you to do things and get away with it, and that just makes you more corrupted over time. That's kind of what a mask does. And so the Klan starts going out on basically terroristic missions. Black people who try to vote are beaten, they're harassed, beaten, burned out of their houses, and just straight up murdered. People who collaborate with the Union government, harassed, murdered. The main object of the main recipients of Klan violence are black people. The main object of Klan violence is that Union occupation and trying to get rid of it. The Klan is a paramilitary society. It attracts tens of thousands of members throughout the South, people who are combat veterans, people who are used to organizing militarily and going off and fighting. So this is a serious threat, and the Union Army devotes a lot of efforts to suppressing it, and it is unsuccessful. The Klan does go away after the end of Reconstruction, just because it has nothing else really to do in that regard. Their goals of racial subordination for black people and getting the Union out are accomplished, and now the government itself is doing that, so what's the problem? The Klan will come back. We'll see that in the 1920s, and then again in the 1960s in response to the Civil Rights Movement. But it is, at this time, one of the major problems the Union Army encounters. One thing you see with a lot of terrorist movements, and this is true of the Klan, Al-Qaeda, IRA, whatever, is that you have a small core group of people who are really committing all the violence. The function of the other members of the group and the surrounding society is to give moral legitimacy to those people and to provide an environment in which they can operate. You have some people committing the violence, then you have people in the Klan who aren't doing the violence who just allow these people to do it, who support them in their doing it. Then you have a circle of population outside of them who they agree with the methods and the ideas but aren't really willing to do it themselves. And then you have a wider group of people who say, well, I don't really like all this violence stuff they're doing, but I understand, I get, I'm sympathetic to them. And it's in that ocean that the Klan swims. It's true of any terrorist group. Now, don't get the idea that the black population of the South, or in America as a wider society, is just sort of oblivious to this or cowering in terror in response. Black intellectuals look at the situation, and Reconstruction is an opportunity for them to think about, well, what is the future of Black America? How do we as a people fit into this society? And there's a lot of people you could talk about, and if this were a class just about Reconstruction, we would. But the two I want to focus on here are Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington actually grows up in slavery. He is a slave about 5 years old when the Union Army comes through Alabama and frees him. He gets educated through the Freedmen's Bureau and becomes an educator himself. Later in life, he will found Tuskegee College, which is what they call it, an agricultural mechanical school. Still remains to this day an A&M school. And it's founded for that reason because it fits with Booker T. Washington's philosophy. Booker T. Washington thinks that the black population of the South needs education, but the kind of education it needs is not poetry and history and all that stuff. It needs industrial education, industrial training, basically the kind of things that are going to help you fit into this new modern economy as it's developed in the North and is now going to spread to the South. Booker T. Washington's theory is that if black people become economically useful to the wider white population, they'll soon become economically necessary to the wider white population. And thus, the wider white population will give black people more and more rights and eventually equality because they'll be dependent on them. If the blacks withdraw their labor from the economy, it'll hurt the white people. Over and against that, you have the ideas of W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois grows up in the North. He grows up among white people from a free black family, from an older free black family lineage. He's never been a slave. No one in his family has ever been a slave. He's educated. He goes off to Harvard, the first black man to earn a PhD from Harvard, and becomes a pioneering sociologist. He writes treatises about the urban black population in the North, in Philadelphia, and then he comes to the South, a place which to him is very, very foreign, and writes The Souls of Black Folk. He goes around to all these different black communities, he interviews people to kind of get a sense of how the black population in the South lives. For Du Bois, Washington's ideas about industrial education aren't really good. Du Bois thinks that Washington is too eager to accept racial subordination at this point and doesn't see how his plan of getting industrial education is going to one day lead to racial equality. In his view, if you're willing to accept subordination now, there's not really any reason why white people would ever treat you any different. Du Bois advocates education, but not education for everybody. Du Bois believes this concept called the talented tenth. He believes every race is led around by about 10% of its population, the really smart, the really clever, the really creative group. He says this 10% of the black population, people like him, are going to be the ones who uplift the rest of the black race. These people need an education. The education they need is not how to fix tires and all this stuff. They need literature, philosophy, history, all this other stuff that the white leaders are learning. And then they'll be in a position to be black leaders and to take the rest of the black population up into equality. Now, these two men have very different visions. They have very different ideas about how black people are going to integrate into this wider white society. We're going to see other people with other views. But one thing these two guys have in common is they don't share any kind of explicit belief in integration, at least as this is our goal, we need to go for it. They see black people as being a distinct people within America and do not see any real reason why black people should just sort of filter out into the wider white population. For them, you would lose something distinct about black people. They're a minority after all, and so if they mix together, it's going to be the black people who sort of dissolve into this larger America. Integration as a goal comes around later on. And we'll talk about that when we get to the civil rights movement. And of course, and for everybody who wants integration, there's this contrary movement of not just segregation, but separatism. And we'll talk about Marcus Garvey next time, so I won't get too into that. So, what does this all lead up to? How does Reconstruction end? Reconstruction ends in 1877. There's a lot of things in history you can't really say when exactly it ends. It ends then. The American public has a limited appetite for long-term engagements and things that just take decades to accomplish. Americans will be eager for a war. They go to war, war's quick, everybody comes home, bam, that's a good war. A war that drags on, people lose interest. As the body counts pile up, they lose their appetite for it, and they want it to end. And politicians who they supported to do all this in the beginning, they come to dislike at the end. The same is true for occupations. America launches a war, for example, against Iraq, still have soldiers there, still occupying, and it just sort of gradually filters itself out of the American public's consciousness. We saw people in Iraq, what? It's just like that with Reconstruction. The Union Army's been in the South now from 1865 all the way up to 1877. So they've been there 12 years. During that time, a lot of stuff has happened in America. There have been a lot of changes. President Ulysses S. Grant, for example. Ulysses S. Grant is elected president in 1868, serves his 2 terms. He leaves office, and now there's a presidential election, and it comes down to 2 men, Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, and Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican. The election is so fraudulent in the South. There's so much ballot stuffing and violence and intimidation that it becomes impossible for any of the electors there to certify the results. And so whenever there's a contested election, we've seen this before with Henry Clay, it goes to the House. And here's where some Southern politicians step in to make a deal. They say to their Northern counterparts, look, we're Democrats, we want the Democrat Tilden to be president. And it looks like he's the guy who's the actual legitimate winner. However, we're willing to switch our support for Tilden to Hayes, to a Republican, to our political enemy, if there is an understanding that Rutherford B. Hayes is going to pull these troops out of the South when he gets elected. That's what happens. Southerners support Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes ends up being president. And Rutherford B. Hayes says, all right, guys, Reconstruction has been a smashing success. Mission accomplished, pulling everybody out. And that's what he does. Once the Union troops are out of the South, once Reconstruction is declared a success, all of its changes are as undone as they possibly can be, as fast as they can be. A new type of politician, the Redeemer, comes to power. These are Southern Democrats whose goal it is to undo the Reconstruction as much as possible and restore white supremacy. And wave after wave of these Redeemers comes to power in state after state, rolling back all this racial equality stuff that the Union Army had instituted at the point of a bayonet. And in place of that comes this new system, Jim Crow. Jim Crow is more than just laws. It's an entire social system. A social system based on racial segregation and subordination. In other words, black people are to be kept separate and below. It's a new type of racism. Obviously, there's always been racism in the South. There's always been racism all throughout America. But racism in the South was never really about separation before. Blacks and whites lived in very close proximity. It was something people in the North commented on and thought was very strange. The hatred of blacks was not there before this. It's not as if they liked them, but hatred's really the wrong word. Hatred is when you want, oh, I hate this guy. You don't really see people say, oh, I hate my slaves. I hate these people. When you're a master and you walk out in your front yard of your plantation and here's all the slaves working, the world is operating as it should. What is there to hate? You have contempt for these people. You consider them below you, but you don't really have animosity towards them. The animosity comes when people who you consider beneath you are raised to your level and presumed to be your equals. They're the enemy now, and anybody who supports them is the enemy now. Hence the separation, because we now no longer have control of the situation where we can be around these people, and the subordination. Blacks in the South need to be constantly reminded of their inferior status in order to keep things the way we feel nature has ordained it. And that's Jim Crow. Alongside this mythology of Jim Crow comes this other mythology, the idea of the lost cause. As memories of the Civil War fade, as the generations sort of multiply, leading away from it, there's this idea that develops that the South, its cause was just and noble. The Confederate Army that marched off, they were noble warriors like knights from the Middle Ages, romantic war. They marched off to fight, and they were ground down by the overwhelming numbers and industrial might of the North. but their cause was good. The pre-war South was a just and nice place with happy slaves and white people, whether poor or rich, getting along. It's this wonderful, harmonious society, and then the Union came in and destroyed it all. Like any myth, it has some elements that are kind of true, but of course it exaggerates all the good things and hides all the bad things. But this lost cause ideology is really the dominant mode of thinking among Southern intellectuals and Southern historians. And in the South, it's not really challenged until the 1950s and 60s. If you want to see a great example of lost cause ideology, just go watch Gone with the Wind. Great example of that. Even though I think the movie is a little more subversive of that than people give it credit for. Bam, that's another topic, film criticism. And with that, we pass out of Reconstruction and pass out of U.S. History 1. I would like to thank you all for watching. I've enjoyed learning how to make these videos all semester. Please understand, I've had to learn how to do this as I went. I know nothing about computers. I know nothing about video editing. But I have learned as I went along, I hope, what looks good, what doesn't, how to edit film, insert stuff, music, all that. So I hope you've seen an improvement over time. I like to think that even if I start off at the bottom, I can still rise from there. So thank you all for watching and for participating in this class. I have my only major regret is that I wasn't able to come down there more, time constraints being what they are, and I'm very sorry about that. Hopefully next semester I'll be able to arrange things differently where that's possible. But from what I've heard from Ms. Hahn and Ms. McCall, who have worked very, very hard on my behalf, and I'd like to thank both you ladies for that. I've heard very good things about you from what I've seen talking to you guys. You're a very bright, very hardworking bunch, and I said for that reason alone, I regret not being able to see you guys more. So this is Mr. Mumma signing off for U.S. History 1. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next semester.